Welcome. I'm Johanna Gilligan, Chief External Affairs Officer at HomeWise. This is the fifth speaker talk of the Livability in the Land of Enchantment series of 2024. And the title tonight is Visualizing Density, Designing Santa Fe's Future. So we are so thrilled you're here. Thank you so much for joining us. First off, just want to start with our usual thank you to all of our amazing sponsors and partners that really honestly have helped make the evening possible, the series possible, the vision for all of this possible. This is absolutely a collective effort. And you can use the QR code behind me to pull up the program and see the full list of contributors. So round of applause for everyone who's helped make this happen. In a few moments, we will hear from our moderator and speaker. That's me. In a few moments, we'll hear from our speaker. And after we hear from Julie, we'll have some time to ask questions. In response to feedback from you all, from audience members, we're going to take more audience questions tonight, so please queue them up. We take audience questions through a tool called Slido. And you can also use the QR code behind me under Slido info to add your questions. So the way you do that is log into the Wi-Fi. The instructions are on the screen. And then use the QR code to access Slido and input the number shown, 506. Once you're in Slido, you can click Q&A on the green Ask button to submit your questions. So we do encourage people to do this now so they have it up and ready. We will also, in response to audience feedback, have this slide come up again when it's time for questions. But, you know, if questions come up while she's talking, you can just plug them in there. So this is a talk on density, a very charged subject, I would say, in Santa Fe and many other places. And I often think, I think this series often has a kind of especially important talk. And I think density is this year's talk, because density is the thread that really connects so many of the issues that we have been talking about. Affordability, homelessness, walkability. We're going to close out with Jeff Speck next month. And all of these things are kind of the invisible thread connecting them is this idea of density. And yet it's a topic that really brings up a lot of emotions. And so so I'm very excited to have Julie Campoli here with us this evening to talk about this. Julie is a friend. She is a friend that I met through a fellowship we were both a part of, and other folks in this audience are a part of, called the Loeb Fellowship at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. And she has been thinking about and talking about and writing about density and its importance and how we can get it wrong for many, many years now. So, you know, I'm just thrilled to have someone who's got such a thoughtful and sophisticated analysis of the issue with us tonight. A little bit more about Julie. She is an urban designer, editor, and author who writes about urban form and the changing landscape. She combines a planner's perspective with a designer's sensibility to illustrate the built environment and the processes that shape it, helping people understand how design affects the place they live. For 25 years, her design and consulting work for nonprofits, state agencies, and municipalities has helped steer development toward a more compact, walkable pattern. A 2010 Harvard Design School Loeb Fellow, Julie lectures throughout the country on topics of density, affordable housing, urban design, and sustainable transportation. One other note is that Julie comes to us from Burlington, and I think Burlington, Julie caught on to this a long time ago before I was at half of her speed of understanding these issues, and was like, oh, Burlington and Santa Fe have a lot in common. And I think that's really true. She comes from an experience of living in a place that people often move to for its idyllic qualities, which is also Santa Fe, and then sometimes want to stop it from changing. So how we figure out how we change our city together to make it the best version of itself is, I think, our exciting challenge tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Julie up to the stage.
Oh, Joanna, thanks for that introduction. I hope you didn't raise the stakes too much, the most important one of the session. And also, I'm kind of pleased to know that she didn't say Burlington, Vermont. It's nice to know that Burlington has that kind of cachet, that you weren't thinking Burlington, Iowa, or Burlington, Massachusetts. I'd like to thank HomeWise for inviting me to come back to Santa Fe. It's great to be back here, and especially I'd like to thank Veronica for making my stay here comfortable, and also for providing me with a lot of information so that I'm much the wiser about what's going on in Santa Fe than I was about a month ago. I'm so honored to be part of this speaker series because you've had such a wonderful flow of information from some really intelligent voices on these topics. And of course, my field is density. And I've worked a lot with towns that are trying to grow in a much more compact pattern, but they keep stumbling up against this issue of density. And so I'm going to do for you tonight what kind of a very short version of what I've done for so many communities is really kind of pick apart density, talk about why people hate it, some of the basics of density. I just realized I have some reading glasses up here. Oh, much better. Why density numbers don't matter, but also why they do matter sometimes, and the patterns of density that you will see on the ground in Santa Fe. Why denser development is really good and what that good density could look like. So if you've been in any kind of public meeting that is discussing a zoning change or a multi-family housing project, you might have heard some of these phrases. And I've heard them all because I've talked to groups all over the country of different sizes. And, you know, the common refrain is there's negative impressions, and then there's always the phrase, that's not what fill in the blank, whatever community I'm in, that's not what we're all about. And if you might be surprised to think that people in New York City will say the same thing. You know, nobody wants to be like New York City, and I heard it from a planner in New York City who was at a meeting. You're probably wondering who they don't want to be like. And then the answer is Mumbai, because that's what they were saying at those meetings. So you're not alone. A lot of people have a lot of trouble with the word density. So what do you think of when you hear the word density? If you are an American who hasn't spent any time in cities, and maybe you've watched a lot of TV and you're on the older side, this is what might come to mind. You know, a very ancient stereotype now from the last century of a very dysfunctional urban setting. It symbolizes everything that's wrong with cities. Or maybe you think about something like this. Or perhaps this. Very different, but similarly scary. So density's kind of become a proxy for many other things. And it's often anything that you don't want or you don't like. So it's hard for people to visualize density, and they do it in wildly different ways. If you're an architect or a planner, you think of density, you might think of something like this, but many other people will imagine this. And if you're having a conversation about density, and this is in one person's head and this is in the other person's head, it's very difficult to get any common ground. And the reason why, I don't know why my voice is... The reason why people have this reaction is they see a lot of this stuff on the right, and it's just more likely that you're going to see that than you would the project on the left, because that's just a lot harder to build. So people just have come to believe that anything that's dense is inherently less attractive, but that's just not the case at all. So if you take a guess of what the density of these two places is, which one is more dense, and what would the density be? Could you sort of see by telling? And obviously it's, not obviously, but it's the same density, but obviously very different. So you can't really tell when you think of 11.7 units an acre what exactly that's going to look like, because it could take many, many different forms. Here's another example. What 35 units an acre looks like in Detroit is not the same as what it looks like in Pasadena, California. It doesn't give you any clues about what it might be like to live there. Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. is 23, or this block is 23 units an acre. Also, the block in Staten Island is 23 units an acre. We're going to react very differently to those places, even though it's the exact same density level. So it could be off-putting, it could be appealing. And conversely, you can have one block that has a higher, relatively high density of 11.7, right across the street from another block with a density of 3.8. They look vaguely similar. They look like a single-family home neighborhood. One has bigger houses that has apartments in it, and the other is all single-family homes. So the notion that a higher number is going to be bad or worse than a lower, or going to be bad or worse than a lower number, it just doesn't match the reality that's on the ground. So here's some basics about density. It's helpful to know how it's expressed. It's a ratio. It's the number of persons per square mile, or that's for population density, or residential density. It's the number of housing units per acre. And then there are other ways to measure density, different types of density. It's useful to know building density in terms of a floor area ratio, and a lot of planning offices use that measure for much more urban environments. You can try to figure out the number of jobs in a certain area. If you're an economic development person, that's useful, or parking density. Another question is, what is the area? Because that's part of the ratio, is the area. What is the area that's getting measured? It's different if it's big versus if it's small. And in the site development review process, they rely on net density, which is basically to review a proposal. And that's really only the area that's devoted to residential. It doesn't include public rights-of-ways, sidewalk, doesn't include green space. So that number is inherently going to be a bit higher. And then there's gross density, which is most of the numbers you're going to see tonight are gross density figures. That includes sidewalks and streets, maybe half of the street in a block. Anything that's not a residential use could be within that. So that's inherently going to be a much lower number. So you can see how it's kind of slippery. Like you see a number and you think, oh my God, that's dense, or oh my God, that's not dense. And it doesn't have any meaning unless you see a diagram with a border showing exactly what is getting measured. So in some ways, the number is kind of totally irrelevant. And there's a common misconception that density is the same as crowding. You often hear those words together, but it's not the same at all, because one is a mathematical ratio, the number of people or housing units in a given space, and the other is a feeling. It's just a perception. But so what feels crowded? Now, here's an extreme example of South Central Los Angeles, which has a very high population density, but a very low housing unit density. So it's just too many people trying to squeeze into too few apartments. And it happens when housing gets really affordable and the rents are too high, they just live together and they're way too crowded. This is an example of crowding. And ironically, adding housing units is actually going to make that much less crowded. And then people feel like things are crowded because our houses have doubled in size. The median house size has doubled in size since 1950. And our household size has gotten much smaller. So we have much more space per person in our houses. And then when you combine that with the fact that our lot sizes, the median lot sizes have shrunk, then what you're seeing is bigger houses on smaller lots. And when you see that on the landscape, you see all those buildings close together and you think, oh my God, that's too dense, that's crowded. But this is a very unproductive kind of density. It's kind of a building coverage density because it doesn't really provide a lot of housing units. There's just a very inefficient way to house people. So, why measure density? If it doesn't really tell you anything about what a place is going to look or feel like, the reason to do it is because it gives you a sense of how many people are there so that you can gauge whether you can serve them with services like density and transit. And there are actual density thresholds. If you're a transit agency or a retailer or a restaurateur, anyone that wants to start a business and they need people to show up and walk in the door, they're going to need to have a critical mass of people living nearby. In terms of transit, you can have a bus at a gross density of 3 to 4 units an acre, but it's going to have to be heavily subsidized, and the bus is not going to come very often, maybe every half hour. And if you want to get those service levels up, you need to get up to about 7 to 8 units an acre to have the bus come every 15 minutes and then 15 units an acre if you want it to be actually very convenient. And research shows that people just don't ride the bus unless those headways are much smaller because it just doesn't have any measure of convenience. And then bus rapid transit is really actually a wonderful alternative for communities that are not big metro areas and they can pay for expensive rail systems. You know, it's just a way of making a bus much more efficient on the road, and you're kind of fixing the corridor so that people can get on the bus more quickly, and there may be a dedicated lane, and so that spurs a lot of investments around those station areas. But that needs to be about 15 plus units an acre to feed that bus service. And then fixed rail, which I don't think is really going to be a thing here anytime soon. Even though a lot of people talk about fixed rail, you know, you really need 24 plus units an acre at the station areas to be able to sustain that kind of service. And then in terms of stores, you know, everybody wants to have a corner store near their house that they can walk to and pick up a few items. But the retailers don't want to be in places where they're not going to have a lot of people walking in the door. So the threshold is like 6 units an acre to support a small corner store. But if you want a full service supermarket, that's more like 12 units an acre. Now, of course, you have full-service supermarkets here, but it has a much larger catchment areas, and everybody is driving from far away. But in terms of walkable density, these are the kind of levels that are going to support a supermarket in an urban area. So 12 units an acre to support a grocery store. This is what it looks like in Santa Fe, this block just south of the historic center, not too far from here. You know, if you want to get a sense of, 12, you might think, that's not appropriate for Santa Fe, but you got several blocks here that have that density. And that is in an area that has other blocks around it that are equally dense. So you've kind of got enough there to sort of give you a sense of what that can look like. Here's another neighborhood just north of the historic center that has density levels that can support pretty good services. I thought I was very interested in the 17.7 block. I think that has a very traditional compound with very small units inside of it. But that's just a great expression of density that allows a lot of people to live in a part of town that could be very amenity rich and convenient for them. So this is really good, respectable density levels in terms of those services and offering more housing. But this is much more common. You know, this is a section of the east side of town where it's really more in the like 2 to 5 units per acre. And that's just not getting you up to those kind of levels that you can support services. And then when you kind of pop out and look at the census, you know, by the census tract of the whole city, I think this is the city of Santa Fe, you'll notice even though the colors are dark, those are kind of relatively low density numbers. You know, the 1,000 to 5,000 persons per square mile is pretty typical of American suburbs. And the densest areas are really down towards more to the south and the west. And, you know, the part that's 1.4 units an acre is the historic center. And I suspect there might be some hollowing out of that area due to second homes and smaller household sizes. This is, you know, commonly happening in places that experience a lot of tourism. So this is, you know, much more typical of a lot of the coverage in Santa Fe. And unfortunately, it's just not dense enough to support those kind of services that you could walk to. So the only reason you can get there, the only way that you could get there in the car. So it really restricts mobility options and really limits the freedom of movement to people that are in that segment of the demographic that can drive everywhere, excluding, you know, seniors and, well, seniors that are farther along. I guess I'm a senior now and I still drive. But every time you need to get somewhere, you got to hop in a car. So there's been all sorts of research on the benefits of compact development And, they're just racking up. It's pretty clear that you're going to have better environment, you're going to have lower energy costs, you're going to be able to have a more sustainable approach to the world if you live closer together. And, I've, talked about these in many different ways, but the thing that keeps rising to the top now is this issue of housing, because it is just exploding everywhere in the country. And it has become the number one problem to solve. It's in short supply everywhere, and it seems like this is the top of the list here as well. So it's really important to just think density is not the goal, but density is the means to a desirable end. And that desirable end can mean more homes. And it's more supply in the market so that more people have the option to buy or rent in Santa Fe. You have more price points so that people across the economic spectrum can buy or rent here. And then you have a bigger variety of housing types so that you're satisfying the needs of people at all stages of life. So in terms of more homes for people, it's just essentially the fact is that density makes housing more affordable, because land acquisition is one of the biggest chunk of a developer's cost for building housing. And if you can put more structures or more units on a parcel of land, then you're going to be able to spread that cost over and reduce the amount. So, just simply put, attaching 2 units together into one structure, or clustering them around a courtyard, or building up, just makes it so easy. You've got the land, you go up, and you can provide more space for people to live in. It's just a fact that you can do it more affordably on less land if you are willing to put the structures together and go up in height. So remember when apples were just apples? You go in the store and there's like a Red Delicious and maybe a Granny Smith. Well, this is my local grocery store this time of year, and it's just dizzying, the array of apples that you can buy. I mean, have you ever heard of a opalescent apple? And it's wonderful, ag story. But I mean, I sort of think about the single family home that I've been given as the Red Delicious of real estate, is that there's just like one kind. And if you're looking for something different, tough luck. And what we need is just so much more diversity, because households are completely different than they were 40 years ago. And we're not giving people the chance to live, in a smaller space. It's staggering the number of households in the U.S. that are just one person, and that's just going to keep going up. So to think that putting out single-family homes is going to satisfy them is kind of unrealistic. So it's the missing middle, which I'm sure you've heard about. It's the housing that used to occur quite naturally in traditional neighborhoods where you'd have single-family homes, but you'd also have duplexes and fourplexes and townhouses, and they were all over the place. And then they got zoned out in the 20th century. And so a lot of communities are looking at ways to just kind of insert these back in with what's called gentle infill. And it's really, putting these buildings that look like single-family homes back into the neighborhoods that we've zoned for only single-family homes. And so here are some of the ways to do that. ADUs, accessory dwelling units, also known as granny flats, and also known as lane housing. And I know you have your own name for it, which I'll get to. But essentially, the house goes on the front of the lot, and in the rear, you have maybe a garage, maybe just a housing unit, and you can double the density of a block, and it still looks very much like a single-family home neighborhood with garages in the back. You call them casitas here, and you have a very robust tradition of this. So if you haven't already, I urge you to just really embrace this, because it's such a great way to allow people to stay in their homes. It might make it more affordable for them, or have a place to go to when they get older. Maybe they have family live in the front. I mean, I think you're probably familiar with all the ways that casitas can benefit you. But, the essential thing is that this neighborhood would probably be 4 units an acre. But with the casitas, it's probably 7 to 8, depending on the lot sizes. And then there are attached houses, which I call the plexes, the duplex, the triplex, fourplex, as they look in other parts of the country. The triplex is, in this form, is very unique to Boston, and you don't see them very often. Here's a duplex in Tucson, single story, as this other one in Santa Fe is. And Johanna sent me this great photo of the triplex, in the Santa Fe version of a triplex, right here. And those units must be really small. In another part of the country, they'd be 2 stories, so you have an upstairs. So I guess part of the Santa Fe style is keep it low, but I would urge you to think about going upstairs. There's all sorts of wonderful things that go on upstairs. So the fourplex, sometimes it's called the big house because it really essentially looks like a big house. It's kind of a wonderful way to do it because everyone gets their own yard, and it's like a townhouse that's kind of been folded around on itself, but it essentially looks like a large house. And this is the way it might look in New England. And this is kind of a version of the big house, the Casa Pacifica project that HomeWise did, where they took a very large single-family home and subdivided it, kind of did it in reverse. And it performs the same function as it just gives more people a place to live. But it looks like a house. Because people are attached to the idea of house, more so than they're attached to the idea of apartment building. My mission is to make them feel warm and fuzzy about an apartment building, but maybe you're not there yet. And then attaching units together where you share common walls, that just is even more space efficient in terms of maximizing a developable lot. And there are just versions of them all over the country that are quite lovely. And Chris Wilson last month showed a wonderful example here that kind of takes the row house and sort of turns it into itself and creates a courthouse. So it's like row houses around a courtyard, which is a really wonderful, Santa Fe way to do it. And here's another example of that, but the lower density, and I suspect it's because those units are larger than the previous example, but essentially arranged around courtyards in a compound. I was kind of coming from New England. I'm sort of confused by the compound thing. I tried to get out of my hotel, and there was this big fence around everything, and I realized that it's just a very deep part of your tradition, and it's really wonderful to have these forms that celebrate that. And here's another one that doesn't take the same form, but it's really making an effort to build some really wonderful shared common space. So when you're putting people closer together and there's less private outdoor space, you want to make sure that they have, a wonderfully designed green space to go to. And I'm showing this compound of the Commons co-housing because they have limited cars to the outside. So instead of a parking lot in the middle, they have this just absolutely lovely sequence of green spaces throughout that whole development. So that's the benefits you get when you're willing to leave your car on the edge. And then small multi-unit buildings, small apartment buildings, you've got them here. I think you could insert more of these into the existing neighborhoods. And then combining apartments with retail and office studio can really help create more of a community that's got some more things going on than just people living, and create a sense of community, a community of artists or community of makers, or just, people that have just live work opportunities. And then when you combine these different building types into one area, then you're actually creating a whole new neighborhood that has got a lot to offer for different people of different means There's single-family homes, there are duplexes, there's row houses, and it's just a lovely variety of options for people when they're getting into the housing market or renting. And then if you place one of those small apartment buildings, a multi-unit, on the edge of a single-family home neighborhood, this one is 17 units an acre, and that actually might be a net number. I'm not sure, but it bumps up the density of the whole block. So that's a gross density of 10.8. Again, getting you closer to those service levels and providing more places for people to live. So a lot of communities have come to the conclusion that talking about density numbers doesn't get you anywhere. It's much better to focus on what kind of houses, what kind of places do people want to live in, and then let's set that as the goal, and just try to get there. And we're not even going to talk about how dense this is. And that's the approach that my hometown has taken in the last year, and it's been incredibly successful. I've been shocked at how receptive people have been to it, because, and I guess shouldn't be surprised, because they're taking the density discussion out of it. But they just said these are the different types of housing we want, and these are the different levels of density neighborhoods. This is what's currently not allowed. We can't do this. We can't do 2 freestanding buildings on one site. But with the new code, it's a much more flexible in terms of allowing some of those uses. And I was just kind of shocked at how well this went over. I've been to so many meetings in Burlington where people get up and say, no, we can't do this. This is too terrible. And I went to the public hearing for this, and I was shocked by how people had just really understood, oh yeah, this is the kind of house I want to live in, and we need to make things more affordable. This is a good path to do that. So in terms of that desirable end that you're going to get to, it's not just housing, it's the ability to walk, which is what people really want to do. They want to be able to walk to work if they're not working at home, or they want to be able to walk to the store or have their kids walk to school. And, we know by now that it's way more healthy to live that way than to drive everywhere. And I could go on about what makes a place walkable. I wrote a whole book about it. There are all these elements that are necessary and interconnected, but the thing that really matters here is these two things: proximity and density, and you need those working side by side to get any kind of level of walkability. It's really just putting people right near the places where they need to go every day. And so where does density belong? It belongs within a quarter mile, half mile, maybe a mile radius of where everyone's going every day. If it's the state offices, then you want to draw some rings around there and say, we really need to sort of focus on these areas, because that is giving people access to the ability to walk to those places. Maybe it's not the historic center for shopping, but maybe there's some civic activities going on in there that people need to get to. And it looks as if a lot of your commercial activity has migrated out to the highway into town, and that's where your commercial zoning shows where it should go. And I haven't driven out there, but I think if you're like many communities, that's where it's going, because that's where it's the easiest place to build, and it might look kind of like a strip development, but that you can look at that as a fantastic opportunity, because that is the easiest place to add a significant number of housing in a way that is quicker and more affordable, and it's going to create less friction than trying to put it into a place where a lot of people are already living. And it's much faster than the gentle infill approach that I was just describing. And there's just so many communities that have already done this, and they're kind of reaping the benefits of it already. This is a sketch plan for St. Paul, Minnesota, that was done, sometimes in the aughts. And they had this light rail going all through the Twin Cities, and the spur from St. Paul out to the University of Minnesota was going to go on University Avenue, which is kind of this underutilized. It wasn't a highway, but it was kind of a fast arterial. And they just re-envisioned how they could develop that and what that light rail was going to bring to them and how to make the most of that huge public investment by adding lots and lots of housing units along there. So this is what it looks like. This is what it looked like in 2009, and what it looked like in 2016. It's just starting to fill in, and it's not this wall of 4-story buildings along the whole corridor. They've kind of identified specific nodes where they're building up the density with 4- and 5-story buildings, and then creating this wonderful opportunity to get on a very fast-moving transportation device and get to where they want to go without getting stuck in traffic. And if you go down the road of commercial corridor infill development, and I hope you do, you can take advantage of this incredibly time-honored building type that is incredible. It's just all over the world because it's such a successful little way to build a building. It's basically you have commercial services on the ground floor and apartments upstairs, and it fills up the whole block. And you're starting to see a resurgence of these in places all over the country where they're, businesses that might have been out on the strip are building these as infill in existing developments, or they're putting these out on the strip. And this is an example of what Minnesota filled in along their commercial corridor with 4-story apartment buildings, which is right next to this old abandoned railway that's now a greenway. So they're, giving a lot of people the opportunity to live next to something that's a really wonderful amenity. So we've taken, there's 2 different ways to approach land use and transportation, and this is the downward spiral that we've been in as a nation for the last 60 years. We're just like, it just kind of keeps feeding itself. When you only build for the car, then you're just stuck with the car. And in the center, you get all of the costs that are associated with an auto-based transportation system. And corridor planning or infill development is really reversing that into something that's a more virtuous cycle. The more riders you have, the more frequent the service is, the more ability people have to be car-free, the less parking you have to build, and then it offers all those wonderful benefits. And so, but you have to kind of design those corridors to be incredibly comfortable for people that are on foot. And it's really important to remember people kind of focus on the sidewalk and the crosswalks. They want to make something walkable, so they build pedestrian infrastructure. But it's really not about the sidewalk. If you take these people that are standing and having a lovely time chatting with each other, and you put them somewhere that doesn't have something nice around it, they have a really nice, smooth sidewalk. They're very safe, but there's no way that they would be standing there. As a matter of fact, I know that location. I've never seen anyone standing there. And it's because it's everything that's next to the sidewalk. It's the building. It's the stores that these folks can go to. It's the way that it is scaled and detailed. And streetscape design is not, it's not complicated. It's not rocket science, and it doesn't have to be expensive. You just need to kind of understand the basics. Is that you need an edge. It has to be permeable. You need to be able to see other human beings that are inside. You need to be able to know you can go inside. You need to have lights that are at scale, a nice canopy overhead with some trees, a building that's articulated in a way so that when the sun comes in from the side, it just kind of pops, and it's just a beautiful sight. But it takes a lot of thought, but it doesn't necessarily take a lot of money. And this is one of my favorite buildings in Vermont because it was built in the 1900s. It's just 1800s. It's just like this basic middle of a village kind of commercial block building that looks very substantial. And then when you go around the corner to the parking lot, you realize, oh, this is what it really looks like. But the people that did this, they understood the essential fact that what they're building is a stage set, is that you want to put your best face to the front where the public is, where your pedestrians are going to be invited in, and that's really kind of what it's all about. And you got to kind of get into that mentality when you're designing for people that are walking on foot. So as you rewrite your town plan together, it's really important to define what good density is. And I've discovered, all the work I've done, I've discovered there's actually are universal qualities of good and bad density. And I've learned this through doing this exercise over and over all across the country, where we took aerial photographs of neighborhoods at similar densities, both close up and, back out in a larger context. And we showed them to people all over the country and asked them to rank them. Which ones do they like? Which ones do they hate? And to describe why they hate the ones they hate and why they like the ones they like. And to just use language to describe the good and the bad. And it really matters what comes up at the top and what comes on at the bottom, because it gives you some guideposts about what you want and what you don't want in your town. And it was striking that the same words sort of kept coming over. And it didn't matter whether it was like a rural area or urban or low density or high. These characteristics of bad density were consistent. And this is the slide that people consistently said, that is what we do not want. And then for the good density, it was always the same attributes. And this neighborhood in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, came to the top of almost every community session that we had all over the country, except in northern Vermont, where people went, kind of sick of it. The one thing that came across loud and clear is that everybody hates parking. And that's good reason, because parking ruins everything. You can put it in the middle, and then you got a big parking lot in the middle of your development. You can put it around the edge, and then it kind of cuts you off from everything around you. Or you can just put it all over the place. These are the kind of solutions that you're kind of forced in when you have to provide a lot of parking spaces for every unit. And, you could blame it on the vicious cycle. It's a systemic problem. But I think that it's also a state of mind, which we might be able to blame on Doris Day parking. And Doris Day parking Doris Day made a lot of movies in the 50s and 60s, and remarkably, all of them had a scene where she arrives. I've got this on a loop, so you can watch it over and over again. Where she arrives wherever she's going in her Cadillac, right up front, fur and heels, and marches right into the front door. Never has to worry about finding a spot. Okay, I think we've seen enough of Doris. All right, I'm going to let you watch it a little bit more, because you can relive the glory of this. Because you have had moments when you have found Doris Day parking. It's absolutely satisfying. And it's why you drive around the parking lot over and over and over, because you want that spot right near the front, because you want to get that feeling of control and power and excitement. I'll admit, I'm that way too. But this is the problem, is that it's absolutely impossible to give everybody Doris Day parking all the time. But that's what we're trying to do when we build landscapes that prioritize parking. There has to be so many parking spaces for every person that lives there, and every person that might be thinking about living there, or every person that might be thinking about visiting to that place. And so in the process, that you're just kind of pushing everything farther and farther apart, and you end up with these places that are really designed for cars, and what I call like a 40-mile-an-hour place, where it doesn't really matter what things look like, because you're driving in a car so fast that you don't actually see it. So it's a systemic problem, but I think if we have an attitude adjustment, we might be able to create more places like this, where you don't have a parking space right out front. Maybe it's down the street, or maybe it's back at home and you rode your bike or whatever. I think that we all kind of fall prey to this notion of that we're so in a hurry all the time that we don't have time to walk. We don't build that into our schedule, or we don't choose locations that are walkable. And so we kind of fall into this trap of just wanting and needing very convenient parking. But in a place like this, density makes so much sense, and walking is very, very easy. So I'm going to finish with a few slides about the reality of what good design can do and what it can't do. It makes it easier, but it doesn't make it easy, because there's so many arguments that come up in the process of talking about infill development. I'm sure you've heard them. And many of these are not related to how something looks or how it's designed. And And you could answer a lot of these charges with good factual information and research studies. But unfortunately, that's not really going to win the day, because at the root of so many battles over development, if you can't read that, the bottom one says, change is inevitable, deal with it. The bottom line is we are not a species that's good with change. There's been really interesting research about loss aversion, and it shows that people are so much more afraid of losing something. They get more pleasure, they get more pain from losing something than they get pleasure from gaining something, and that gamblers will just waste so much money trying to make back their loss. Or, think about the last time you lost an item that you cared about, and just how bad that made you feel. Even if someone could give you a new one just like it, it's not the same as the old one. So they're going to feel that loss more intensely, and that's really what they're just really afraid of losing something in their community, and it's loss aversion that can lead us to fall into two camps: deeply skeptical or absolutely opposed. You have a tendency to imagine the worst, and so that leads you to generally prefer the status quo than risk getting something awful, even though the odds of getting something like this are pretty slim. But it's especially true in places like Santa Fe, because people come here because they love it, and they don't want it to change. They want it to. I think everyone wants it to continue to be wonderful, and it's tempting to just think, well, wonderful means exactly the same. The stakes seem so high, and then people feel fear in the development process because there's this, feeling that someone else is competing, and they're going to win, and they're going to take advantage, and the process isn't fair, and other people are going to lose, and that's just terribly upsetting, and that someone else is benefiting from your loss. It's either the swooping developers or the people from California. You must have people from California here because it's not that far away. But in my neck of the woods, it's people from New York. But we all have, this sort of fear of the outsider. And then there's this element of tribalism that we are just so handicapped by right now in the United States. And we tend to be comfortable with people that are just like us. And, we might have an identity as a city dweller or a suburbanite or an environmentalist, a Republican or a Democrat. And it's very easy to mistrust that person on the other side of the table that's not in your group. And it's easy to assume that they are wrong. So it's really crucial to actually really listen to what they're saying, repeat it back to them so that they can see that you understand. Treat members of the other tribe just as with respect, just the way that you would want to be treated. And, despite our fear of change, it's important to know it's going to happen. In fact, it's the one thing that we can be certain of. But the good news is that once that change happens, humans are really good at adapting. I think the pandemic kind of taught us that. Is like massive change. And I think, we're reeling from it, but we've done a lot of workarounds. And, we did a lot of workarounds when it was happening. This is kind of evidence that we know how to recorrect, and that the shockingly new eventually becomes familiar, and then it often becomes beloved. So this is a daycare center in my neighborhood, and they have a binky tree. And it's a wonderful thing, because when a toddler is ready to give up their binky, which is hard when you're like 2 years old or 3 years old, they have a celebration, and they all go outside, and they hang it on the binky tree, and they sing a song. And then when the kids come and go, they see their binky up there, and they think, yeah, I used to need that, but I don't need it anymore because I'm big. So it's just a wonderful example of celebrating change. It's hard, but you can get to the other side of it. So I would just urge you to focus on how as a community you can shape that change, and even though it's scary, just turn it into something wonderful that you will get used to. Thank you.
Yes. Well, that lived up to my expectations. Also, I think my questions are in your green room, so we're winging it right now. So
That was the only copy?
it's great. It's no problem.
Okay.
So thank you. I really feel like you covered so much ground with that, and we are gonna just ask a couple questions before we turn it over to the audience. Again, if you want to ask a question, here's the instructions. One of the things that we didn't talk about tonight yet is climate change and higher density urban infill and its relationship versus sprawl to climate change. And as an affordable housing developer in Santa Fe, as many other developers and designers in this room, we've often heard environmental arguments used against infill development projects. And I was reading in your book today that, you know, people often think of urban as sometimes not environmental because it's not nature. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about sprawl and its connection to climate change both ways. Like just a little bit on how it's contributed, but also a lot of what do you think sprawl, how is it going to hold up in the future?
Not well. It's interesting was when I wrote Visualizing Density, it was really more of an environmental consideration, and then when I wrote Made for Walking, it was more climate change and carbon, and you know, of course, they're related. But I'm happy to report that density or compact development, and I urge you to think of it that way, or infill development rather than just density, really helps solve a lot of problems in both of those respects. I would, if you're interested in the counterintuitive idea that dense places are way more environmentally benign, I would urge you to look at a book by a New Yorker staff writer named David Owens, who wrote a book called Green Metropolis, and I think it was in 2009, and he described his move with his family from Manhattan, the change from living in the middle of Manhattan to living in a really rural area of Connecticut, and all of the ways that he was having a much more huge and negative impact on the environment by living that kind of lifestyle. And it had to do with, you know, the amount of driving that he did, the number of cars that he had to add to their household, the number of trips that they had to take every day versus walking everywhere in Manhattan or taking a subway. The house was much bigger, and they had to fill it up with a lot more stuff, and they had to heat it and cool it, and you know, just kind of added up to a whole lot of energy consumed, a whole lot of materials used, a whole lot of stuff that goes to the landfill versus when you're living in a smaller place and you're not acquiring as much stuff. And it was just kind of, you know, remarkable to sort of understand that, you know, you think you're living a very virtuous environmental life when you're out in the country, and that's not necessarily the case. So then you can say, okay, well, we're going to have an energy efficient house, and we're going to have an electric car. And, you know, the research just shows that a very large net zero state-of-the-art house is going to be worse in terms of energy consumed than a very space efficient, traditionally heated and cooled house. So it's really, you know, a situation where scale really matters. You know, the bigger your house, the bigger your climate impact is going to be. And just in terms of heating and cooling and transportation are the biggest negative impacts for carbon. And if you've got a house that's sharing a wall, if you've got people upstairs and downstairs, that means fewer exterior walls. And that is a much more efficient way to heat and cool a structure than if you have a single family home. And then, of course, I talked a little bit about, you know, the driving that you have to do when you're in a low density pattern. That is really a very negative effect because transportation is a third of our country's emissions. And that's huge compared to other places that have much more compact development pattern and much better alternative transportation networks. Does that answer?
Yeah, and that does. And how do you think this, as we start to struggle with, I mean, in Santa Fe, for example, there's starting to be issues with certain residents on the edge of the city losing their insurance. So I see that also as a future element of climate change, that just maintaining the level of infrastructure that's needed and the crossover in some ways between sprawl development that may be in areas closer to, for example, the forest, like that it'll just add a lot of complexity to how we live in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's wildfire risk. Is that yeah, I mean, that it's, if you're closer in and you're not in this area that can burn easily, of course. So you want to create the opportunities to house people in those areas that are lower risk. And if in New Mexico it is in those areas that are already built up, then that makes absolute sense. I mean, it's a complicated topic because, like in Vermont, we've got a flood problem, and our compact development, our traditional centers are in flood zones. So we're struggling with like, oh, let's find another place to put these people that's not in harm's way. And so, you always have to be assessing the risk of a certain area and doing what makes sense from a risk management perspective, but also create the kind of communities that are going to be environmentally sound and meet the needs of the people that are living there.
I think at the end of your presentation, you really got to how so much of the change to especially in places like that were kind of primarily developed around the car, this is a cultural shift, right? This is a cultural shift towards a different kind of way of living, or in our case, maybe a return to a way of living that existed much longer ago. And we just did our first project with shared parking, and it's hard for people to accept that they may come home and they can't park right in front of the place that they live, right? So there's that. But then there's also this reality that I think we are in this new moment of dealing with climate change and this affordability crisis, which are kind of this twinned issue. And I feel that there is also this moment and opportunity for the kind of significant cultural shifts that need to happen. And I'm just curious, like, do you think that these really deep challenges that we're wrestling with also offer that kind of opportunity to hopefully like leapfrog to a new way of thinking about things? For example, here we're part of the phase 1 land use code update includes a density bonus for projects that deliver a significant amount of affordable housing. And the last 2 nights of community engagement, people have been generally really supportive around that. So it kind of affirms my sense that maybe people are really willing to make those trade-offs if it's reaching the right goal.
Yeah, I mean, if people can see it, if they can see that more satisfying, convenient lifestyle and how that's going to work for them, then they're going to be able to make that shift. And it's easier for younger people, and I think the generation that's coming up, which is so clearly aware of the impact of climate on their lives, or that issue's more in the forefront, so they're going to be thinking in terms of that more, and maybe they'll be more willing to make that shift. And I think the millennials at least are a little bit more urban focused and more interested in alternative ways of getting around. And I think it's with anything, if you can get a good project in the ground that people can say, oh yeah, I get it. I could live there, I could do that, or my kid lives there, or my cousin lives there, and this is how they do it. We're just so bad in America living in even a somewhat urban environment that, we just really need to kind of be shown through examples, shown through images, having it in the air, talking about it constantly. I've noticed that people that come from more urban places, they don't have a problem with walking down the street to park their car. It's just a matter of expectations. You're going to build up a critical mass of people that just kind of feel like it's not as big a barrier as it might seem.
Thank you. Veronica.
Why are so many Americans scared of density despite loving their European vacations featuring walkable multifamily buildings?
It's such a good question. I know that you can experience it and go, this is so cool, and then come back and think, I want to live that way. But it's very hard because of the systemic problem. It's very hard to kind of, when you're back here, to find your way to that, because it never seems like an option. I do think that there are more and more people that are more aware of the walkable urban alternative, and they want it, but they can't afford it because those places are so popular that they kind of get scooped up by people with more money. And there aren't enough, to kind of satisfy the market. So I do think that people want it, but they don't have access to it. But you're right. I mean, I think we fall back into our old patterns of, getting in the car and going everywhere and then getting upset that there's not a free parking space. It's as I said in the show, it's just a constant challenge. And, and I've been in this world, and I know so many planners that believe deeply in their hearts in smart growth, but they never go anywhere not in their car. It's just like, or if you're at a public meeting and you're talking to people that are really in favor of transit, and you ask them, well, what's the number of the bus that goes through your part of town? Have you ever taken the bus? They have no idea because taking the bus is for someone else, but it's a really good idea. So I think we have to just really constantly, when we're suggesting these things, is it something that I do? Is it something that I want to do? Is it something that, if I'm recommending it to someone else, it should be part of my life.
Another great audience question that's very related. What are the unique challenges of the Western U.S.? We're built to suit car culture. How can we reverse generations of urban design/infrastructure mistakes?
Yeah, I know. It's a lot harder because you don't have those sort of all over, examples that you can say, oh, yeah, that's the way they did it. And I mean, you do have them. They're just really much fewer and farther between. It's interesting because I keep thinking of where the plaza is downtown, because, I always think of the downtown as where all the investment goes, where the energy goes, where the business is happening. And I've noticed that out here, there's more of a tendency to just, you have the historic thing, and that's where the tourists are. And maybe I'm wrong about this. Correct me if I am. But then there's the real life place.